In the England of 1440, salt was not a luxury, nor a garnish scattered for taste. It was life itself. In the age before ice houses, before smokehouses reached every village, salt was the silent guardian of survival. A slab of meat without salt would rot in days. A barrel of fish, without its crystalline shield, would sour before it ever reached a hungry mouth. For the poor, it was the difference between enduring a long winter and perishing before spring. For the merchant, it was trade, livelihood, and promise. And for the crown, it was gold in another form, white gold measured not in glittering ingots, but in handfuls of grain that could be taxed, hoarded, and sold under royal decree. And so it was that salt, simple and essential, became shackled to power. The king's men stood at the docks, their armor glinting even in the gray fog, watching as crates were unloaded from distant coasts. Their eyes were not on the weary sailors nor the ragged porters who strained under the weight. Their gaze was fixed upon the salt itself, stacked like treasure, guarded as though each sack contained jewels. To them, it was not sustenance. It was sovereignty. The monopoly was law, and law was written by the will of the throne. Beneath this gaze, the merchants whispered. They bent their heads close, speaking in voices thin as smoke, eyes darting like hunted prey. Their hands shook as they counted coins, not from cold, but from fear. A misstep in the trade, a purchase outside the crown's channels, and ruin would follow. Prison, torture, the scaffold. These were not distant threats. They were promises, sharpened by precedent. Every man in that harbor knew someone who had dared bend the rules, and every man could recall how swiftly that daring ended in silence. Yet in the marketplace, beyond the walls of authority, another voice began to rise. It belonged to a man who did not wear silks nor gold, but whose stance carried weight. Richard Wyche, a merchant hardened by wind and trade, his face lined not only by years but by conviction. He did not whisper like the others. He spoke aloud, his words carried by the murmur of the crowd, cutting through the hiss of fear like a blade through cloth. "Salt is not gold," he declared. And though his lips never trembled, every soul who heard him felt the ground shift beneath them. To some, his cry was a spark of hope, small yet searing, igniting the thought that perhaps the crown's grip could be resisted. To others, it was terror itself, for words spoken against monopoly were words spoken against majesty, and majesty was not merciful. Faces turned toward him, some lit with the dangerous flicker of agreement, others shadowed with dread. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, sensing the tension without understanding the peril. The market for a heartbeat stood suspended between silence and uproar. For Wyche, there was no turning back. To speak such words was to walk a path already marked with gallows and iron. Yet he did not falter. In his stance was not folly, but defiance. The defiance of a man who saw salt for what it was, a gift of earth and sea, not a jewel for crowns to hoard. His features, weathered by years of toil, seemed carved in stone that day, immovable, unyielding. And in that frozen moment, with eyes upon him and whispers coiling through the air, the scene became more than a marketplace. It became theater. The stage was set, the actors already chosen. A merchant with courage, a crown with wrath, and a people caught in between, their fates bound to whichever hand proved stronger. Thus began the story of Richard Wyche, not with sword nor rebellion, but with salt, not with a blow, but with a word. And in the England of 1440, a word could be more dangerous than any weapon. Night in medieval England was not kind. It was not the quiet balm of stars and silence that later poets would sing of. It was harsh, unforgiving, alive with suspicion. In the dim taverns of London, where smoke curled from damp wood and ale dripped from cracked mugs, men spoke only in murmurs. Their eyes wandered not in curiosity, but in fear. Fear of ears that did not belong to friends. Fear of words that could be twisted into treason. In such a world, even laughter carried the weight of danger. Richard Wyche sat alone in that flickering gloom, a merchant who had dared to speak what others only dared to think. Before him, a cup of ale half finished, its froth long gone flat, as though time itself had thickened the air around him. He was no rebel lord, no knight with sword and shield. He was a man of trade, a dealer in goods, yet burdened with the most dangerous possession of all, a voice that had defied a king. Beyond the tavern walls, the streets lay soaked in rain, cobblestones shining like dark mirrors. Horses' hooves echoed faintly in the distance, mingling with the hiss of water dripping from eaves. The city breathed uneasily as if it sensed what was to come, for when the crown marked a man, it was only a matter of time before the hand of power reached out to claim him. The door did not creak. It exploded. The silence shattered in an instant, the night pierced by iron and flame. Royal soldiers stormed into the tavern, their armor clattering, torches casting monstrous shadows upon the walls. The light revealed faces startled in mid-whisper, mugs frozen halfway to lips, and at their head the captain's voice rang out like a sentence already carved in stone. There was no trial here, no pretense of debate, only the king's decree, carried not on parchment but on the steel of swords. The accusation was treason. The punishment was already known. Richard rose, but only briefly. Rough hands seized him, dragging him down, his body striking the filthy floorboards with a dull thud. Boots struck his ribs, iron chains snapped shut around his wrists. His struggle was not against victory, but against inevitability. For in that moment, it was not justice that reigned, but theater, the theater of power, staged before frightened eyes to remind all who watched that the crown's reach was absolute. The tavern, once filled with muttered discontent, now held only silence, broken by the clash of shackles. Men looked down at their drinks, women pressed hands to their mouths, unwilling to breathe too loudly. To speak, even to protest, was to risk sharing his fate, and so they watched in silence as one of their own was claimed. Dragged through the threshold, Richard was flung into the cold embrace of the streets. Rain fell harder now, soaking his linen shirt, turning the dirt beneath him into black mud. The torches hissed as drops struck their flames, yet the soldiers marched on, unmoved by the storm. From the shadows of shuttered windows, townsfolk peered out, faces pale, lips trembling. Some made the sign of the cross. Others whispered prayers too faint to carry. All of them knew they were witnessing not just the fall of one man, but the warning meant for all. For in that age, defiance was not forgiven. It was silenced. Kings ruled not with parchment and pen, but with lash and axe, with fire and rope. To stand against monopoly was to stand against monarchy, and monarchy did not compromise. It consumed. As Richard stumbled through the streets, chains biting into his flesh, his figure seemed already half spectral, half legend, a man condemned before his death. He was not yet broken, but the path before him was carved deep with suffering. Every splash of water beneath his dragging feet echoed with the same truth. Resistance had a price, and that price was to be paid not in coin, but in blood. Thus ended the night for Richard Wyche, not with rest nor with respite, but with capture and chains, the prelude to a torment meant to echo across the land. For in the eyes of the crown, he was no longer a merchant. He was an example. And in the theater of kingship, examples were made in pain. The hall of judgment was not built for mercy. Its stones were cold, its arches towering, designed not to comfort, but to crush. Shadows clung to the vaulted ceiling, where the banners of the crown hung heavy, their colors dark with centuries of blood and authority. This was not a place where truth was weighed. It was a place where truth was buried. Richard Wyche was brought forth into that chamber, his body already marked by chains and fists, his face bruised, his clothes torn. Yet still he stood, not tall, not unbroken, but upright. In a world where even the whisper of defiance could be a death sentence, his very stance was defiance enough. Before him sat the judges, robed in crimson, the color of majesty, the color of blood. Their faces were not of men but of instruments, sharpened to serve the crown. The charge was treason, not against neighbor, not against church, but against monopoly, against the salt that filled the king's coffers. To the crown that was rebellion enough, for salt was not mere grain, it was power distilled, gold disguised as necessity, and Wyche had dared to say aloud what others dared only in silence, that it belonged to the people. The hall echoed with ritual, the gavel struck, the scroll was read, the judge's voice rang like iron striking iron. There was no question of innocence, no search for proof. In that age, a trial was not a weighing of evidence, but a theater of control. Its purpose was not to determine guilt, but to display power, to remind the trembling masses that the crown could not be questioned, that even the smallest word could summon the executioner's hand. And yet in that hollow chamber, there lingered a tremor. For when Richard Wyche lifted his head, when he clenched his fists and met their gaze, he did not beg. He did not plead. His voice, though ragged, carried steady, a declaration that truth was not treason. And in those words was a defiance sharper than steel. It was the kind of defiance that unsettles tyrants, not because it changes the verdict, but because it refuses to kneel. The crowd gathered in the gallery gasped, some recoiling as if the very sound of resistance might stain them, others clutching their cloaks in silence, torn between fear and admiration. For they knew what was to come. The punishment had already been written, centuries old, perfected in cruelty, hanging, drawing, quartering. It was not death alone, but a dismantling of body, of dignity, of memory itself. To hear it spoken aloud was to feel the weight of inevitability, the machinery of monarchy grinding down upon a single man. When the gavel fell again, it was not the sound of wood on wood. It was the sound of a life sealed, of a fate chained to torment. No outcry could change it, no witness could stay it. In that instant, Richard Wyche ceased to be a merchant. He became something else, a warning, a spectacle, a sacrifice to the theater of fear. And yet, within that silence, within that judgment, something endured. His words hung in the air, too stubborn to die. Truth is not treason. The judges dismissed them, the scribes ignored them, but those who had ears to hear could not erase them. They would follow Richard from that chamber into the square, from scaffold to scaffold, echoing louder with each lash of cruelty the crown prepared. For in the England of 1440, trials did not seek justice. They sought obedience, and when obedience faltered, they sought blood. Richard Wyche had offered neither, and so the gavel fell, and the crown answered not with law, but with death. Dawn came not with hope, but with dread. The pale sun rose reluctantly over the town square, casting a weak light on timbers stained by countless deaths. There, at the center of cobblestones slick with frost, stood the scaffold, tall, stark, and merciless. It loomed not as wood and rope, but as a symbol, the throne's will made flesh. Every plank whispered of agony past. Every knot bore the memory of lives unmade. The people gathered in silence, their breath hanging white in the morning air. They came not from choice, but from fear. For to stay away was to invite suspicion, and in an age when suspicion could kill as swiftly as steel, attendance was obedience. Mothers clutched children to their skirts, men folded arms across their chests, and all eyes fixed on the gallows where one man's body would become a spectacle for all. Richard Wyche was dragged forward, his wrists bound in iron, chains biting his skin. Stripped to his linen shirt, he stood exposed before the gaze of the crowd and the judgment of the crown. He was no longer the merchant of the marketplace, no longer the man whose voice had risen against tyranny. Here, before the scaffold, he was cast as traitor, his very body condemned to serve as warning. The executioner, faceless beneath a hood, stepped into place with ritual precision. The noose was lifted, heavy with purpose, its coarse rope brushing against Wyche's bruised skin. The crowd inhaled sharply as though each breath was drawn through the same knot. For all knew what the rope promised, yet fewer understood its cruelty. To hang, the voice of the age seemed to whisper, but not to die. For this rope was no instrument of mercy, no swift end to suffering. It was but the first chapter of torment, designed to break the body slowly, to unmake dignity before life itself slipped away. The trap gave way. Wyche's body lurched violently, legs thrashing against air, muscles straining against the pull. His face turned deep with suffocation, veins bulging at his temples, eyes wild with the primal fight for breath. He convulsed, each spasm a grim dance upon the scaffold. Each moment stretched into eternity. The crowd recoiled, torn between horror and fascination. Some covered their children's eyes, others stared as though compelled by forces stronger than their will. Silence pressed heavy, broken only by the sound of choking, the sound of a man suspended between life and death. But death was not to claim him, not yet. The rope, having done its part, was severed. His body dropped like stone, crashing against the boards with a sickening thud. He lay gasping, chest heaving, blood speckling his lips as he coughed life back into failing lungs. The square erupted in whispers, a wave of horror sweeping through the mass of onlookers. For they understood now, the hanging was not the end. It was the beginning. This was the ritual of punishment in its truest form. Not justice, but theater. Pain was the script, and the condemned its unwilling actor. Every gasp, every shudder of Wyche's body was a lesson written in flesh, a warning to the living that the crown's hand reached further than any hope of mercy. And as Wyche lay upon the scaffold, bound yet breathing, he was not spared. He was reserved for torments yet to come, for agonies deeper still, for the slow unraveling of body and soul that awaited in the chapters beyond. The noose had tightened, but not to kill. The rope had burned, but not to end. In the cruel logic of the age, survival was not gift. It was curse. For what began at dawn was but the first act of a darker play, and Richard Wyche, merchant turned rebel in the eyes of the crown, had only stepped into its opening scene. There are punishments meant to end a life, and there are punishments meant to prolong it. What awaited Richard Wyche was not death alone, but the deliberate tearing apart of body and spirit, an agony scripted by power, staged for the eyes of the fearful. They bound him to the wooden frame, rough timbers biting into flesh already bruised. The crowd pressed tighter, yet none spoke. They knew what was coming, for this was no secret cruelty hidden behind stone walls. This was public, intentional, designed so that each scream would etch itself into memory, carried home to hearths and whispered to children as warning. The executioner stepped forward, blade glinting in the pale light. His hand did not tremble. For him, this was craft, ritual honed by repetition, duty carried out beneath the gaze of the crown. And as the steel descended, it was not mercy that cut, but theater. The knife plunged. A sound rose, not from steel, but from Wyche's throat, a scream that seemed to shatter the very air. It tore through the square, ripped through the silence of dawn, and drove itself into the marrow of all who heard. Mothers clutched children tighter, men clenched jaws, yet none could close their ears. Pain had a voice, and that voice would not be silenced. They called it justice, but justice was not the goal. It was spectacle. The blade moved again, drawing lines across a body now reduced to canvas. Blood flowed, steam rising where warmth met the morning chill. The executioner's hand delved deeper, crueler, until the secret architecture of life itself was dragged into the open. Entrails glistened in the gray light, lifted before Wyche's dimming eyes, as though to remind him that even his own body no longer belonged to him. He writhed upon the frame, chest heaving, lips trembling with the effort to breathe. Each gasp was defiance, each cry weaker than the last. And yet he endured, because endurance was demanded of him. This punishment was not meant to kill swiftly. It was meant to unravel, to strip away not only flesh, but dignity, to leave behind a ruin that others would remember long after the man himself was gone. But the spectacle did not end with the knife. The next act was yet crueler still. Ropes were fastened to his limbs, arms and legs stretched outward, tied to horses restless with fear and command. The air grew taut with expectation, the silence broken only by the snorting of beasts and the restless shuffle of feet in the crowd. Then the whip cracked. The horses lunged. The ropes snapped taut, and Wyche's body was pulled in 4 directions at once. For a moment he remained whole, a body stretched beyond nature, veins and sinews straining against impossible force. Then came the sound, the tearing of what was never meant to tear, the snapping of bones like branches in storm. The crowd recoiled. Some turned away, pressing hands to faces. Others stood frozen, eyes wide with horror, compelled by the very brutality they longed to escape. Mothers shielded their children, yet even behind covered eyes the sounds carried, screams, cracks, the dreadful music of a life destroyed in pieces. This was the crown's justice, not swift, not merciful, but deliberate. Pain as performance, suffering as scripture, written into the bodies of the condemned so the living might never forget. And on that day, Richard Wyche became not only a man undone, but a symbol, proof that defiance was punished not by silence, but by spectacle. Silence fell heavy upon the square, a silence deeper than sound itself. Where once there had been screams, the crack of whips, the sickening tear of flesh, now there was only stillness. The scaffold stood dark against the morning haze, its planks slick with the memory of blood. And upon it, Richard Wyche no longer remained a man. He had been reduced to fragments, limbs severed, body scattered, dignity erased by decree. Soldiers moved with grim efficiency, lifting what was left as though handling spoils of war. An arm raised like a banner, a leg bound in burlap, each piece carried not to burial but to display. For this was the final act of punishment, not death, not even torment, but obliteration. The body once whole was divided and nailed upon city gates, cast upon crossroads, planted like warnings where every traveler might see and remember. In this way, the crown declared its message. Defiance will not only kill you, it will scatter you, erase you, unmake you from memory. And yet memory is never so obedient. In taverns thick with smoke, men whispered of what they had seen. They spoke not of justice, but of terror. They spoke of a merchant whose voice had risen against the weight of the crown, who had faced the rope and the blade without surrender. They whispered of his scream that shook the air, of the courage that lingered even as flesh was torn apart. In those whispers, Wyche endured, not as traitor, not as criminal, but as a man who dared. In markets where women bartered for grain and children tugged at their mothers' skirts, his name lingered too. Not always spoken aloud, for fear still pressed heavy on every tongue, but carried in glances, in nods, in the quiet recognition that one among them had stood for more than coin. To some he was warning, to others he was hope. Either way he was remembered. The soldiers could carry his limbs to the gates. They could scatter his body to the winds, but they could not scatter the truth that lived in his defiance. For truth once spoken takes root where no axe can reach. And so the scaffold, once the center of spectacle, began to fade. The square dissolved into mist, cobblestones swallowing the footprints of the crowd. The gallows shrank into the distance, less wood than shadow, less rope than memory. But what remained was not silence, it was echo. The echo of a life destroyed in pieces, yet refusing to vanish whole. For kings wrote their power in blood. They carved their authority into flesh, built their dominion upon terror. But blood dries, flesh decays. What endures is not the cruelty of rulers, but the courage of those who defied them. Richard Wyche, merchant of England, paid the price in agony. Yet his name passed from lips to lips. His defiance etched itself into the conscience of a people who could not forget. Thus ended his body, but not his story. For memory is stubborn. Memory clings where it should fade, grows where it is forbidden, and whispers where silence is demanded. Kings may claim obedience, but memory belongs to the defiant. And in that truth, Richard Wyche lived on.